So hi everyone, COP28 is approaching. This is the much anticipated annual climate summit. This year it's being hosted by the United Arab Emirates, UAE. Representatives of about 200 countries of the world will gather together in Dubai to discuss and deliberate on the problem of climate change. So today I'm joined by some of my great colleagues. Each of us is going to be going there to observe what are some of the outcomes we expect, what are some of the contentious topics which will lead to certain disagreements between different blocks of countries. So we'll walk through some of those details today. So one of the big headline issues this year at COP is going to be the global stocktake. And it's been a 2-year-long process. It was written into the Paris Agreement. And to shed a little more light, I'll turn to Tamanna. So firstly, what is the global stocktake? What are some of the expected disagreements and some of the discussions we can expect on the issue? Why don't you tell us?
So the global stocktake, or the GST, it's the first ever assessment of countries' progress towards the climate targets. And this is the first ever GST to take place. So we're expecting some interesting conclusions in the political phase at COP28. We've had one synthesis report come out of the 3 technical discussions in September. There was one more summary report that came out of the countries' positions on what the final outcome should look like in October. And there was an intersessional workshop held in October as well. What we saw there was that although there is some conclusion happening on what the outline looks like, what it should contain is still debated. It's something we also saw in a recently released paper last week on the countries' positions on what the global stocktake should look like.
Right.
So we're still seeking more clarity on what the final outcome will be. We don't know if it will be a cover decision or something else as a GST outcome. But the GST does feed into a lot of parallel processes on adaptation, loss and damage, and even whether there will be new NDCs. So it'll be interesting to see how this shapes up at COP28.
So another huge headline issue this year is the question of loss and damage. So I turn to my colleague Akshit Sangomla. He's a correspondent at Down to Earth. Akshit has been intensely following the loss and damage discussions. So what are some of the recent updates that have taken place and what do you expect out of COP28?
I think first we need to also understand what loss and damage actually is. The global average temperatures have been very high throughout the year, this year, and this year is well on track to be one of the warmest ever on record. And we have seen extreme weather events happen all throughout the year. For instance, massive floods in Libya, the heat waves in Europe, and floods in Himachal Pradesh, etc. And many of these impacts of climate change, losses and damages that are occurring due to them are irreversible in nature. So these are losses which are beyond adaptation, which communities can't adapt to, and that is why they are counted as loss and damage. So this fight has been going on for the past 3 decades. And finally, last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, at COP27, basically the loss and damage fund was established for the first time. But what happened was it got into a lot of entanglements due to differences in opinion of where the fund should be located, how it should be governed, its structure, where the secretariat of the fund should be.
And developing countries have a very strong reason to not want the World Bank to host this fund because the World Bank typically gives money as loans and not grants. So reasons like that.
Yeah, basically yes, because the cut of the fees is also very high. It used to be 12% earlier, then it became 17%. It is at 24% right now, which is extremely high. And for debt-ridden countries, countries which are already debt-ridden, these developing countries which are most vulnerable to loss and damage, for them going to the World Bank and accessing this fund would be extremely difficult, and that is why they have been extremely circumspect of this fund being hosted by the World Bank.
Another key negotiation area is the huge topic of mitigation. Of course, mitigation features everywhere. Mitigation features in the global Stocktake. Mitigation comes up in discussions on the cover decision. But in 2021 in Glasgow, this separate negotiation stream called the Mitigation Work Program was established. It was something that was proposed by developed countries, and the goal of this work program was to create a space in which countries can discuss how they can increase mitigation ambition. It could be how clean transportation initiatives can be expanded, how more renewable energy can be scaled up, how industry can be decarbonized. A lot comes under the header of mitigation. A lot of developing countries also had a concern that equity is not being considered in the mitigation work program, which means that too much burden of emission reduction is being placed on poor countries who already have developmental goals. So, putting very strict and higher mitigation targets on them goes against the principle of equity. This year, however, we actually, CSE advocated for the mitigation work program to be a constructive space. What we felt is that, yes, developing countries do need to decarbonize, even though they have a right to grow and develop. But for their own domestic interest, they do need to decarbonize their economies. So we really envision the mitigation work program as a space where developing countries can talk about their mitigation plans and demand the finance and technology transfer required to actually implement those plans. So now we come to the next issue, which is the issue of carbon markets. This is under the big header of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So now I'll turn to my colleague Trishant to talk us through Article 6.2 and 6.8, what's happening and what to expect.
So the Paris Agreement, like the Kyoto Protocol earlier, provides for a carbon market where emission reductions could be traded between countries as sort of a cooperative mechanism to meet their climate targets. The Paris Agreement uses a very specialized term called the market approaches to cooperation, and there are essentially three parts to the Article 6. The Article 6.2 basically provides countries the flexibility and the freedom to enter into bilateral agreements, and through that bilateral agreements, they can create a carbon market wherein they exchange or trade the mitigation outcomes. The focus agenda for COP would be to ready basically the infrastructure that would be needed for the market. Principally, the registries are going to function, and what will be the formats of the reports that countries will submit to UNFCCC, the annual report being the important one. Other than this, there is another part that is Article 6.4. And then there are something called the non-market mechanisms within the Article 6. So going further, we need to see how countries utilize the important provisions of Article 6.2, 6.4, 6.8, and 6.9 to further the agenda of cooperation that goes beyond the existing voluntary carbon markets or the carbon markets, and see cooperation in non-market mechanisms as well.
There's also the all-important Article 6.4, which is essentially about the global carbon market under the UNFCCC. So now I'll invite my colleague Rohini Krishnamurthy, a senior reporter at Down to Earth, who will also be at COP28 and reporting from there. So Rohini, what are some of the developments for Article 6.4 and what is expected from COP28?
The Article 6.4 establishes a market mechanism for a carbon market under the Paris Agreement. So this is going to be succeeding the CDM, which was established under Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah.
So basically what happens is you have a supervisory body which consists of a certain group of experts from each country. So they come up with rules and standards on how this market needs to operate. And they had made a recommendation on removals, which is basically any sort of activity that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It could be natural afforestation and also engineered ones like carbon, fertilization, using the oceans to capture CO2 and stuff.
Yeah.
But there were issues because removals weren't defined properly, and there were also issues with human right violations. So the CMA asked the supervisory body to re-examine that issue and come back. So they've had a couple of meetings this year. So far, they have They made some progress. So there is something on transition of CDM activities to Article 6.4, and they've come up with standards and procedures, and this will be effective, I think, from 1st of January 2024.
So now we come to the crucial issue of finance. Of course, climate finance is a very important issue for developing countries like us in India. To tell us about the new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG. So Seher, over to you.
Right. So I think before getting into what happened at the latest discussions on this goal, I can just tell a little bit about what this goal is actually, what it constitutes and why we're talking about it. In 2009, when COP15 happened, there was this goal of a target of, climate finance of $100 billion per year to be given by developed countries to developing countries per year after 2020. But that has not actually been met in any of the years since this target was announced. While that's a problem, the other issue with this target was that this was not a negotiated climate finance goal. This was just an arbitrary number that came as a result, you could argue, out of panic-struck negotiators at the last minute in a conference that is otherwise also considered as a failure. So now the NCQG that you mentioned, which is basically the new collective quantified goal for climate finance, which is a new goal for this, a new figure or a new amount, as well as a new modality for how climate finance from developed to developing countries should flow. And now at COP28, there is going to be a high-level ministerial dialogue. So ministers and heads of states from various parties are going to meet, and a lot of the points that were suggested by technical experts at these TEDs are going to be discussed by the ministers. And one main thing at the last TED that was requested to be passed on for the ministerial discussion on its agenda was what are these elements for political consideration that the minister should discuss in order to ensure that the new collective quantified goal is actually determined before 2025.
And finally, we have the big issue of decarbonization, particularly for the industrial sector. Industry is a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, but it is also known that certain industrial subsectors are very difficult to decarbonize, and these are specifically known as hard to abate sectors. So I'll invite my colleague Parth Kumar. He's a program manager in the Industrial Pollution Program at CSE and our resident industrial decarbonization expert. So Parth, what are some of the conversations happening around industrial decarbonization, hard to abate sectors? What are the big developments, and what do you expect at COP28?
It is important to understand that industry globally is contributing more than 30% of the global emissions. And I think more than other industries, there are a few sectors which are a bit of a problem for reducing emissions because they are highly dependent on fuels and chemical processes which are carbon intensive. And the shift here is that a lot of manufacturing has now shifted to these emerging economies. And with the net zero targets coming in, these economies also need to decarbonize. But along with having their developmental growth needs. So this is a double challenge that these economies are facing. A lot of decarbonization technology, which is important for these sectors, has to be imported from developed countries, and there's hardly any money flowing into R&D for understanding the kind of technologies which will help them domestically.
So thank you to all my wonderful colleagues for sharing detailed updates about the various negotiation themes. Other than these, there's also the triple energy target that many countries are advocating for. So the COP28 presidency will put forth the target of tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030, doubling of energy efficiency efforts, and some language around the phase out of fossil fuels. If language on this triple target makes it into the text, it will be incredibly ambitious, and we definitely are advocating for this to happen. Other than that, Akshit, do you want to tell them about our presence at COP?
Yes, so our team was going to be on the ground at COP28 in Dubai from 29th of November to 14th of December. And please follow our Twitter handle and CSE's website and Down to Earth's website and Down to Earth's Twitter handle for all the updates from the ground on negotiations, on daily events, on interviews that we'll be conducting there, and also videos from the ground as well. So yes, see you all at COP.
See you at COP.